A near view of the High Sierra. Early one bright morning in the middle of the Indian summer, while the glacier meadows were still crisp with frost crystals, I set out from the foot of Mount Lyell on my way down to Yosemite Valley to replenish my exhausted store of bread and tea. I had spent the past summer, as many preceding ones, exploring the glaciers that lie on the headwaters of the San Joaquin, Tuolumne, Merced, and Owens rivers, measuring and studying their movements, trends, crevices, moraines, etc., and the part they had played during the period of their greater extension in the creation and development of the landscapes of this great alpine wonderland. The time for this kind of work was nearly over for the year, and I began to look forward with delight to the approaching winter with its wondrous storms, when I would be warmly snowbound in my Yosemite cabin with plenty of bread and books. But a tinge of regret came on when I considered that possibly I might not see this favorite region again until the next summer, excepting distant views from the heights about the Yosemite walls. To artists, few portions of the High Sierra are, strictly speaking, picturesque. The whole massive uplift of the range is one great picture, not clearly divisible into smaller ones, differing much in this respect from the older and what may be called riper mountains of the Coast Range. All the landscapes of the Sierra, as we have seen, were born again, remodeled from base to summit by the developing ice floods of the last glacial winter. But all those new landscapes were not brought forth simultaneously. Some of the highest, where the ice lingered longest, are tens of centuries younger than those of the warmer regions below them. In general, the younger the mountain landscapes, younger, I mean, with reference to the time of their emergence from the ice of the glacial period, the less separable are they into artistic bits capable of being made into warm, sympathetic, lovable pictures with appreciable humanity in them. Here, however, on the headwaters of the Tuolumne, is a group of wild peaks on which the geologist may say that the sun has but just begun to shine, which is yet in a high degree picturesque, and in its main features so regularly and evenly balanced as almost to appear conventional. One somber cluster of snow-laden peaks with gray, pine-fringed granite bosses braided around its base, the whole surging free into the sky from the head of a magnificent valley, whose lofty walls are beveled away on both sides so as to embrace it all without admitting anything not strictly belonging to it. The foreground was now aflame with autumn colors, brown and purple and gold, ripe in the mellow sunshine, contrasting deeply with the deep cobalt blue of the sky, and the black and gray and pure spiritual white of the rocks and glaciers. Down through the midst, the young toluene was seen pouring from its crystal fountains, now resting in glassy pools, as if changing back again into ice, now leaping in white cascades, as if turning to snow, gliding right and left between granite bosses, then sweeping on through the smooth, meadowy levels of the valley, swaying pensively from side to side with calm, stately gestures, past dipping willows and sedges, and around groves of arrowy pine, and throughout its whole eventful course, whether flowing fast or slow, singing loud or low, ever filling the landscape with spiritual animation and manifesting the grandeur of its sources in every movement and tone. Pursuing my lonely way down the valley, I turned again and again to gaze on the glorious picture, throwing up my arms to enclose it as if in a frame. After long ages of growth in the darkness beneath the glaciers, through sunshine and storms, it seemed now to be ready and waiting for the elected artist, like yellow wheat for the reaper, and I could not help wishing that I might carry colors and brushes with me on my travels and learn to paint. In the meantime, I had to be content with photographs on my mind and sketches in my notebooks. At length, after I had rounded a precipitous headland that puts out from the west wall of the valley, every peak vanished from sight, and I pushed rapidly along the frozen meadows, over the divide between the waters of Merced and Toluene, and down through the forests that clothe the slopes of Cloud's Rest, arriving in Yosemite in due time, which, with me, is any time. And strange to say, among the first people I met here were two artists who, with letters of introduction, were awaiting my return. They inquired whether, in the course of my explorations in the adjacent mountains, I had ever come upon a landscape suitable for a large painting. Whereupon I began a description of the one that had so lately excited my admiration. Then, as I went on further and further into details, their faces began to glow, and I offered to guide them to it, while they declared that they would gladly follow, far or near, whithersoever I could spare the time to lead them. Since storms might come breaking down through the fine weather at any time, burying the colors in snow and cutting off the artist's retreat, I advised getting ready at once. I led them out of the valley by the Vernal and Nevada Falls, thence over the main dividing ridge to the big Tuolumne Meadows by the old Mono Trail, and thence along the upper Tuolumne River to its head. This was my companion's first excursion into the High Sierra, and as I was almost always alone in my mountaineering, the way that the fresh beauty was reflected in their faces made for me a novel and interesting study. They naturally were affected most of all by the colors, the intense azure of the sky, the purplish grays of the granite, the red and browns of dry meadows, and the translucent purple and crimson of huckleberry bogs, the flaming yellow of aspen groves, the silvery flashing of the streams, and the bright green and blue of the glacier lakes. But then the general expression of the scenery, rocky and savage, seemed sadly disappointing, and as they threaded the forest from ridge to ridge, eagerly scanning the landscapes as they were unfolded, they said, "All this is huge and sublime, but we see nothing as yet at all available for effective pictures. Art is long, and art is limited, you know. And here are foregrounds, middle grounds, and backgrounds, all alike. Bare, rock waves, woods, groves, diminutive flecks of meadow, and strips of glittering water." "Never mind," I replied. "Only bide a wee, and I will show you something you will like." At length, toward the end of the second day, the Sierra crown began to come into view, and when we had fairly rounded the projecting headland before mentioned, the whole picture stood revealed in the flush of the alpenglow. Their enthusiasm was excited beyond bounds, and the more impulsive of the two, a young Scotchman, dashed ahead, shouting and gesticulating and tossing his arms in the air like a madman. Here, at last, was a typical alpine landscape. After feasting a while on the view, I proceeded to make camp in a sheltered grove a little way back from the meadow, where pine boughs could be obtained for beds, and where there was plenty of dry wood for fires, while the artists ran here and there along the river bends and up the sides of the canyon, choosing foregrounds for sketches. After dark, when our tea was made and a rousing fire had been built, we began to make our plans. They decided to remain several days, at the least, while I concluded to make an excursion in the meantime to the untouched summit of Rudder. It was now about the middle of October, the springtime of snowflowers. The first winter clouds had already bloomed, and the peaks were strewn with fresh crystals, without, however, affecting the climb to any dangerous extent. And as the weather was still profoundly calm, and the distance to the foot of the mountain only a little more than a day, I felt that I was running no great risk of being storm-bound. Mount Ritter is king of the mountains of the middle portion of the High Sierra, as Shasta of the north and Whitney of the south sections. Moreover, as far as I know, it had never been climbed. I had explored the adjacent wilderness summer after summer, but my studies thus far had never drawn me to the top of it. Its height above sea level is about 13,300 feet and is fenced round by steeply inclined glaciers and canyons of tremendous depth and ruggedness, which render it almost inaccessible. But difficulties of this kind only exhilarate the mountaineer. Next morning, the artists went heartily to their work, and I to mine. Former experiences had given good reason to know that passionate storms, invisible as yet, might be brooding in the calm sun gold. Therefore, before bidding farewell, I warned the artists not to be alarmed should I fail to appear before a week or 10 days, and advised them, in case a snowstorm should set in, to keep up big fires and shelter themselves as best they could, and on no account to become frightened and attempt to seek their way back to Yosemite alone through the drifts. My general plan was simply this: to scale the canyon, wall, cross over to the eastern flank of the range, and then make my way southward to the northern spurs of Mount Ritter, in compliance with the intervening topography. For to push on directly southward from camp through the innumerable peaks and pinnacles that adorn this portion of the axis of the range, however interesting, would take too much time, besides being extremely difficult and dangerous at this time of year. All my first day was pure pleasure, simply mountaineering, indulgence, crossing the dry pathways of the ancient glaciers, tracing happy streams, and learning the habits of the birds and marmots in the groves and rocks. Before I had gone a mile from camp, I came to the foot of a white cascade that beats its way down a rugged gore in the canyon wall from a height of about 900 feet, and pours its throbbing waters into the Tuolumne. I was acquainted with the fountains, which, fortunately, lay in my course. What a fine traveling companion it proved to be! What songs it sang, how passionately it told the mountain's own joy. Gladly, I climbed along its dashing border, absorbing its divine music and bathing from time to time in waftings of irised spray. Climbing higher, higher. Now beauty came streaming on the sight. Painted meadows, late blooming gardens, peaks of rare architecture, lakes here and there, shining like silver, and glimpses of the forested middle region and the yellow lowlands far in the west. Beyond the range, I saw the so-called mono desert, lying dreamily silent in thick purple light, a desert of heavy sun glare, beheld from a desert of ice-burnished granite. Here the waters divide, shouting in glorious enthusiasm, and falling eastward to vanish in the volcanic sands and dry sky of the Great Basin, or westward to the Great Valley of California, and thence through the Bay of San Francisco and the Golden Gate to the sea. Passing a little way down over the summit until I had reached an elevation of about 10,000 feet, I pushed on southward toward a group of savage peaks that stand guard about Ritter on the north and west, groping my way and dealing instinctively with every obstacle as it presented itself. Here, a huge gorge would be found, cutting across my path, along the dizzy edge of which I scrambled until some less precipitous point was discovered, where I might safely venture to the bottom, and then, selecting some feasible portion of the opposite wall, reascend with the same slow caution. Massive, flat-topped spurs alternate with the gorges, plunging abruptly from the shoulders of the snowy peaks and planting their feet in the warm desert. These were everywhere marked and adorned with characteristic sculptures of the ancient glaciers that swept over this entire region like one vast ice wind, and the polished surfaces produced by the ponderous flood are still so perfectly preserved that in many places the sunlight reflected from them is about as trying to the eyes as sheets of snow. God's glacial mills grind slowly, but they have been kept in motion long enough in California to grind sufficient soil for a glorious abundance of life, though most of the grist has been carried to the lowlands, leaving these high regions comparatively lean and bare, while the post-glacial agents of erosion have not yet furnished sufficient available food over the general surface for more than a few tufts of the hardiest plants. And it is interesting to learn in this connection that the sparseness and repressed character of the vegetation at this height is caused more by want of soil than by harshness of climate. For here and there, in sheltered hollows, countersunk beneath the general surface, into which a few rods of well-ground moraine chips have been dumped. We find groves of spruce and pine, 30 to 40 feet high, trimmed around the edges with willow and huckleberry bushes, and oftentimes still further by an outer ring of tall grasses, bright with lupines, larkspurs, and snowy columbines, suggesting a climate by no means repressingly severe. All the streams, too, and the pools at this elevation are furnished with little gardens wherever soil can be made to lie, which, though making scarce any show at a distance, constitute charming surprises to the appreciative observer. In these bits of leanness, a few birds find grateful homes. Having no acquaintance with man, they fear no ill, and flock curiously about the stranger, almost allowing themselves to be taken in the hand. In so wild and beautiful a region was spent my first day, every sight and sound inspiring, leading one far out of himself, yet feeding and building up his individuality. Now came the solemn, silent evening. Long, blue, spiky shadows crept out across the snowfields, while a rosy glow, at first scarce discernible, gradually deepened and suffused every mountain top. This was the alpenglow, to me one of the most impressive of all the terrestrial manifestations of God. At the touch of this divine light, the mountains seemed to kindle into a rapt, religious consciousness, and stood hushed and waiting like devout worshippers. Just before the alpenglow began to fade, 2 crimson clouds came streaming across the summit lake, like wings of flame, rendering the sublime scene yet more impressive. Then came darkness and the stars. Icy Ritter was still miles away, but I could proceed no farther that night. I found a good campground on the rim of a glacier basin, about 11,000 feet above the sea. A small lake nestles in the bottom of it, from which I got water for my tea, and a storm-beaten thicket nearby furnished abundance of resiny firewood. Somber peaks, hacked and shattered, circled halfway around the horizon, wearing a savage aspect in the gloaming, and a waterfall chanted solemnly across the lake on its way down from the foot of a glacier. The fall and the lake and the glacier were almost equally bare, while the scraggy pines anchored in the rock fissures were so dwarfed and shorn by storm winds that you might walk over the tops. In tone and aspect, the scene was one of the most desolate I ever beheld. But the darkest scriptures of the mountains are illuminated with bright passages of love that never fail to make themselves felt when one is alone. I made my bed in the nook of the pine thicket, where the branches were pressed and crinkled overhead like a roof, and bent down around the sides. These are the best bedchambers the high mountains afford, snug as squirrel nests, well ventilated, full of spicy odors, and with plenty of wind-played needles to sing one asleep. I little expected company, but creeping in through a low side door, I found 5 or 6 birds nestling among the tassels. The night wind began to blow soon after dark. At first, only a gentle breathing, but increasing toward midnight to a rough gale that fell upon my leafy roof in ragged surges, like a cascade, bearing wild sounds from the crags overhead. The waterfall sang in chorus, filling the old ice fountain with its solemn roar, and seeming to increase in power as the night advanced. Fit voice for such a landscape. I had to creep out many times to the fire during the night, for it was biting cold, and I had no blankets. Gladly, I welcomed the morning star. The dawn, in the dry, wavering air of the desert, was glorious. Everything encouraged my undertaking and betokened success. There was no cloud in the sky, no storm tone in the wind. Breakfast of bread and tea was soon made. I fastened a hard, durable crust to my belt by way of provision, in case I should be compelled to pass a night on the mountain top. Then, securing the remainder of my little stock against wolves and wood rats, I set forth, free and hopeful. How glorious a greeting the sun gives the mountains! To behold this alone is worth the pains of any excursion 1,000 times over. The highest peaks burned like islands in a sea of liquid shade. Then the lower peaks and spires caught the glow, and long lances of light, streaming through many a notch and pass, fell thick on the frozen meadows. The majestic form of Ritter was full in sight, and I pushed rapidly on over rounded rock bosses and pavements, my iron-shod shoes making a clanking sound, suddenly hushed now and then in rugs of bryanthus and sedgy lake margins soft as moss. Here, too, in this so-called land of desolation, I met cassiope growing in fringes among the battered rocks. Her blossoms had faded long ago, but they were still clinging with happy memories to the evergreen sprays, and still so beautiful as to thrill every fiber of one's being. Winter and summer, you may hear her voice, the low, sweet melody of her purple bells. No evangel among all the mountain plants speaks nature's love more plainly than cassiope. Where she dwells, the redemption of the coldest solitude is complete. The very rocks and glaciers seem to feel her presence and become imbued with her own fountain sweetness. All things were warming and awakening. Frozen rills began to flow. The marmots came out of their nests in boulder piles and climbed sunny rocks to bask, and the dun-headed sparrows were flitting about, seeking their breakfasts. The lakes, seen from every ridgetop, were brilliantly rippled and spangled, shimmering like the thickets of the low dwarf pines. The rocks, too, seemed responsive to the vital heat rock crystals and snow crystals thrilling alike. I strode on, exhilarated, as if never more to feel fatigue, limbs moving of themselves, every sense unfolding like the thawing flowers to take part in the new day harmony. All along my course thus far, excepting when down in the canyons, the landscapes were mostly open to me and expansive, at least on one side. On the left were the purple plains of Mono, reposing dreamily and warm. On the right, the near peaks springing keenly into the thin sky with more and more impressive sublimity. But these larger views were at length lost. Rugged spurs and moraines and huge projecting buttresses began to shut me in. Every feature became more rigidly alpine, without, however, producing any chilling effect. For going to the mountains is like going home. We always find the strangest objects in these fountain wilds are in some degree familiar, and we look upon them with a vague sense of having seen them before. On the southern shore of a frozen lake, I encountered an extensive field of hard, granular snow, up which I scampered in fine tone, intending to follow it to its head and cross the rocky spur against which it leans, hoping thus to come direct upon the base of the main Ritter Peak. The surface was pitted with oval hollows, made by stones, and drifted pine needles that had melted themselves into the mass by the radiation of absorbed sun heat. These afforded good footholds, but the surface curved more and more steeply at the head, and the pits became shallower and less abundant, until I found myself in danger of being shed off like avalanching snow. I persisted, however, creeping on all fours and shuffling up the smoothest places on my back, as I had often done on burnished granite, until, after slipping several times, I was compelled to retrace my course to the bottom and make my way around the west end of the lake, and thence up to the summit of the divide between the headwaters of Rush Creek and the northernmost tributaries of the San Joaquin. Arriving on the summit of this dividing crest, one of the most exciting places of pure wilderness was disclosed that I ever discovered in all my mountaineering. There, immediately in front, loomed the majestic mass of Mount Ritter, with a glacier swooping down its face nearly to my feet, then curving westward and pouring its frozen flood into a dark blue lake, whose shores were bound with precipices of crystalline snow, while a deep chasm drawn between the divide and the glacier separated the massive picture from everything else. I could see only the one sublime mountain, the one glacier, the one lake, the whole veiled with one blue shadow rock, ice and water close together, without a single leaf or sign of life. After gazing spellbound, I began instinctively to scrutinize every notch and gorge and weathered buttress of the mountain, with reference to making the ascent. The entire front above the glacier appeared as one tremendous precipice, slightly receding at the top and bristling with spires and pinnacles set above one another in formidable array. Massive lichen-stained battlements stood forward here and there, hacked at the top with angular notches, and separated by frosty gullies and recesses that have been veiled in shadow ever since their creation. While to right and left, as far as I could see, were huge, crumbling buttresses, offering no hope to the climber. The head of the glacier sends up a few finger-like branches through narrow places, but these seemed too steep and short to be available, especially as I had no axe with which to cut steps, and the numerous narrow-throated gullies down which stones and snow are avalanched seem hopelessly steep, besides being interrupted by vertical cliffs, while the whole front was rendered still more terribly forbidding by the chill shadow and the gloomy blackness of the rocks. Descending the divide in a hesitating mood, I picked my way across the yawning chasm at the foot and climbed out upon the glacier. There were no meadows now to cheer with their brave colors, nor could I hear the dun-headed sparrows, whose cheery notes so often relieve the silence of our highest mountains. The only sounds were the gurgling of small rills down in the veins and crevices of the glacier, and now and then the rattling report of falling stones, with the echoes they shot out into the crisp air. I could not distinctly hope to reach the summit from this side, yet I moved on across the glacier as if driven by fate, contending with myself. The season is far too spent, I said, and even should I be successful, I might be storm-bound on the mountain, and in the cloud darkness, with the cliffs and crevices covered with snow, how could I escape? No, I must wait until next summer. I would only approach the mountain now and inspect it, creep about its flanks, learn what I could of its history, holding myself ready to flee on the approach of the first storm cloud. But we little know, until tried, how much of the uncontrollable there is in us, urging across glaciers and torrents and up dangerous heights, let the judgment forbid as it may. I succeeded in gaining the foot of the cliff on the eastern extremity of the glacier, and there discovered the mouth of a narrow avalanche gully, through which I began to climb, intending to follow it as far as possible, and at least obtain some fine wild views for my pains. Its general course is oblique to the plane of the mountain face, and the metamorphic slates of which the mountain is built are cut by cleavage planes in such a way that they weather off in angular blocks, giving rise to irregular steps that greatly facilitate climbing on the sheer places. I thus made my way into a wilderness of crumbling spires and battlements, built together in bewildering combinations, and glazed in many places with a thin coating of ice, which I had to hammer off with stones. The situation was becoming gradually more perilous, but having passed several dangerous spots, I dared not think of descending, for so steep was the entire ascent, one would inevitably fall to the glacier in case a single misstep was made. Knowing, therefore, the tried danger beneath, I became all the more anxious concerning the developments to be made above, and began to be conscious of a vague foreboding of what actually befell. Not that I was given to fear, but rather because my instincts, usually so positive and true, seemed vitiated in some way and were leading me astray. At length, after attaining an elevation of about 12,800 feet, I found myself at the foot of a sheer drop in the bed of the avalanche channel I was tracing, which seemed absolutely to bar further progress. It was only about 45 or 50 feet high, and somewhat roughened by fissures and projections, but these seemed so slight and insecure as footholds that I tried hard to avoid the precipice altogether by scaling the wall of the channel on either side. But, though less steep, the walls were smoother than the obstructing rock, and repeated efforts only showed that I must either go right ahead or turn back. The tried dangers beneath seemed even greater than that of the cliff in front. Therefore, after scanning its face again and again, I began to scale it, picking my holds with intense caution. After gaining a point about halfway to the top, I was suddenly brought to a dead stop, with arms outspread, clinging close to the face of the rock, unable to move hand or foot, either up or down. My doom appeared fixed. I must fall. There would be a moment of bewilderment, and then a lifeless rumble down the one general precipice to the glacier below. When this final danger flashed upon me, I became nerve-shaken for the first time since setting foot on the mountains, and my mind seemed to fill with a stifling smoke. But this terrible eclipse lasted only a moment, when life blazed forth again with preternatural clearness. I seemed suddenly to become possessed of a new sense, the other self, bygone experiences, instinct, or guardian angel, call it what you will, came forward and assumed control. Then my trembling muscles became firm again, Every rift and flaw in the rock was seen as through a microscope, and my limbs moved with a positiveness and precision with which I seemed to have nothing at all to do. Had I been borne aloft with wings, my deliverance could not have been more complete. Above this memorable spot, the face of the mountain is still more savagely hacked and torn. It is a maze of yawning chasms and gullies, in the angles of which rise beetling crags and piles of detached boulders that seem to have been gotten ready to be launched below. But the strange influx of strength I had received seemed inexhaustible. I found a way without effort, and soon stood upon the topmost crag in the blessed light. How truly glorious the landscape circled around this noble summit. Giant mountains, valleys innumerable, glaciers and meadows, rivers and lakes, with the wide blue sky bent tenderly over them all. But in my first hour of freedom from that terrible shadow, the sunlight in which I was laving seemed all in all. Looking southward along the axis of the range, the eye is first caught by a row of exceedingly sharp and slender spires, which rise openly to a height of about 1,000 feet, above a series of short residual glaciers that lean back against their bases. Their fantastic sculpture and the unrelieved sharpness with which they spring out of the ice, rendering them particularly wild and striking. These are the minarets. Beyond them, you behold a sublime wilderness of mountains, their snowy summits towering together in crowded abundance, peak beyond peak, swelling higher, higher as they sweep on southward, until the culminating point of the range is reached on Mount Whitney, near the head of the Kern River, at the elevation of nearly 14,700 feet above the level of the sea. Westward, the general flank of the range is seen flowing sublimely away from the sharp summits in smooth undulations, a sea of huge gray granite waves, dotted with lakes and meadows, and fluted with stupendous canyons that grow steadily deeper as they recede in the distance. Below this gray region lies the dark forest zone, broken here and there by upswelling ridges and domes. And yet beyond lies a yellow, hazy belt, marking the broad plain of the San Joaquin, bounded on its farther side by the blue mountains of the coast. Turning now to the northward, there, in the immediate foreground, is the glorious Sierra Crown, with Cathedral Peak, a temple of marvelous architecture. A few degrees to the left of it, the gray, massive form of Mammoth Mountain to the right, while Mounts Ord, Gibbs, Dana, Conness, Tower Peak, Castle Peak, Silver Mountain, and a host of noble companions, as yet nameless, make a sublime show along the axis of the range. Eastward, the whole region seems a land of desolation, covered with beautiful light. The torrid volcanic basin of Mono, with its one bare lake 14 miles long, Owens Valley and broad lava table, land in its head, dotted with craters, and the massive Inyo Range, rivaling even the Sierra in height. These are spread map-like beneath you, with countless ranges beyond, passing and overlapping one another, and fading in the glowing horizon. At a distance of less than 3,000 feet below the summit of Mount Ritter, you may find tributaries of the San Joaquin and Owens rivers, bursting forth from the ice and snow of the glaciers that load its flanks, while a little to the north of here are found the highest affluents of the Tuolumne and Merced. Thus, the fountains of 4 of the principal rivers of California are within a radius of 4 or 5 miles. Lakes are seen gleaming in all sorts of places, round or oval or square, like very mirrors. Others, narrow and sinuous, drawn close around the peaks like silver zones, the highest reflecting only rocks, snow, and the sky. But neither these, nor the glaciers, nor the bits of brown meadow and moorland that occur here and there are large enough to make any marked impression upon the mighty wilderness of the mountains. The eye, rejoicing in its freedom, roves about the vast expanse, yet returns again and again to the fountain peaks. Perhaps some one of the multitude excites special attention, some gigantic castle with turret and battlement, or some Gothic cathedral more abundantly spired than Milan's. But generally, when looking for the first time from an all-embracing standpoint like this, the inexperienced observer is oppressed by the incomprehensible grandeur, variety, and abundance of the mountains rising shoulder to shoulder beyond the reach of vision. And it is only after they have been studied one by one, long and lovingly, that their far-reaching harmonies become manifest. Then, penetrate the wilderness where you may, the main telling features, to which all the surrounding topography is subordinate, are quickly perceived, and the most complicated clusters of peaks stand revealed, harmoniously correlated and fashioned, like works of art, eloquent monuments of the ancient ice rivers that brought them into relief from the great general mass of the range. The canyons, too, some of them a mile deep, mazing wildly through the mighty host of mountains, however lawless and ungovernable at first sight they appear, are at length recognized as the necessary effect of causes which followed each other in harmonious sequence. nature's poems carved on tables of stone, the simplest and most emphatic of her glacial compositions. Could we have been here to observe during the glacial period, we should have overlooked a wrinkled ocean of ice as continuous as that now covering the landscapes of Greenland, filling every valley and canyon with only the tops of the fountain peaks rising darkly above the rock-encumbered ice waves like islets in a stormy sea. Those islets, the only hints of the glorious landscapes now smiling in the sun. Standing here in the deep, brooding silence, all the wilderness seems motionless, as if the work of creation were done. But in the midst of this outer steadfastness, we know there is incessant motion and change. Ever and anon, avalanches are falling from yonder peaks. These cliff-bound glaciers, seemingly wedged and immovable, are flowing like water and grinding the rocks beneath them. The lakes are lapping their granite shores and wearing them away. And every one of these rills and young rivers is fretting the air into music and carrying the mountains to the plains. Here are the roots of all the life of the valleys. And here, more simply than elsewhere, is the eternal flux of nature manifested. Ice changing to water, lakes to meadows, and mountains to plains. And while we thus contemplate nature's methods of landscape creation, and reading the records she has carved on the rocks, reconstruct, however imperfectly, the landscapes of the past, we also learn that, as these we now behold have succeeded those of the pre-glacial age, so they in turn are withering and vanishing to be succeeded by others yet unborn. But in the midst of these fine lessons and landscapes, I had to remember that the sun is wheeling far to the west, while a new way down the mountain had to be discovered to some point on the timberline where I could have a fire, for I had not even burdened myself with a coat. I first scanned the western spurs, hoping some way might appear through which I might reach the northern glacier and cross its snout, or pass around the lake into which it flows, and thus strike my morning pass. This route was soon sufficiently unfolded to show that, if practicable at all, it would require so much time that reaching camp that night would be out of the question. I therefore scrambled back eastward, descending the southern slopes obliquely at the same time. Here, the crags seemed less formidable, and the head of a glacier that flows northeast came into sight, which I determined to follow as far as possible, hoping thus to make my way to the foot of the peak on the east side, and thence across to the intervening canyons and ridges to camp. The inclination of the glacier is quite moderate at the head, and as the sun had softened the snow, I made safe and rapid progress, running and sliding, and keeping up a sharp outlook for crevices. About half a mile from the head, there is an ice cascade, where the glacier pours over a sharp declivity and is shattered into massive blocks separated by deep blue fissures. To thread my way through the slippery mazes of this crevassed portion seemed impossible, and I endeavored to avoid it by climbing off to the shoulder of the mountain. But the slopes rapidly steepened, and at length fell away in sheer precipices, compelling a return to the ice. Fortunately, the day had been warm enough to loosen the ice crystals, so as to admit of hollows being dug in the rotten portions of the blocks, thus enabling me to pick my way with far less difficulty than I had anticipated. Continuing down over the snout and along the left lateral moraine was only a confident saunter, showing that the ascent of the mountain by way of this glacier is easy, provided one is armed with an axe to cut steps here and there. The lower end of the glacier was beautifully waved and barred by the outcropping edges of the bedded ice layers, which represent the annual snowfalls, and to some extent the irregularities of the structure caused by the weathering of the walls of crevices, and by separate snowfalls which have been followed by rain, hail, thawing and freezing, etc. Small rills were gliding and swirling over the melting surface with a smooth, oily appearance in channels of pure ice, their quick, compliant movements contrasting most impressively with the rigid, invisible flow of the glacier itself, on whose back they all were riding. Night drew near before I reached the eastern base of the mountain, and my camp lay many a ragged mile to the north, but ultimate success was assured. It was now only a matter of endurance and ordinary mountain craft. The sunset was, if possible, yet more beautiful than that of the day before. The mono landscape seemed to be perfectly saturated with warm purple light. The peaks marshaled along the summit were in shadow, but through every notch and pass streamed vivid sunfire, soothing and irradiating their rough, black angles, while companies of small, luminous clouds hovered above them like very angels of light. Darkness came on, but I found my way by the trends of the canyons and the peaks projected against the sky. All excitement died with the light, and then I was weary. But the joyful sound of the waterfall across the lake was heard at last, and soon the stars were seen reflected in the lake itself. Taking my bearings from these, I discovered the little pine thicket in which my nest was, and then I had a rest such as only a tired mountaineer may enjoy. After lying loose and lost for a while, I made a sunrise fire, went down to the lake, dashed water on my head, and dipped a cupful for tea. The revival brought about by bread and tea was as complete as the exhaustion from excessive enjoyment and toil. Then I crept beneath the pine tassels to bed. The wind was frosty, and the fire burned low, but my sleep was none less sound, and the evening constellations had swept far to the west before I woke. After thawing and resting in the morning sunshine, I sauntered home. That is, back to the Tuolumne camp, bearing away toward a cluster of peaks that hold the fountain snows of one of the north tributaries of Rush Creek. Here, I discovered a group of beautiful glacier lakes, nestled together in a grand amphitheater. Toward evening, I crossed the divide, separating the Mono waters from those of the Tuolumne, and entered the glacier basin that now holds the fountain snows of the stream that forms the upper Cascades. This stream I traced down through its many dells and gorges, meadows and bogs, reaching the brink of the main camp at dusk. A loud whoop for the artists was answered again and again. Their campfire came in sight, and a half-hour afterward, I was with them. They seemed unreasonably glad to see me. I had been absent only 3 days. Nevertheless, though the weather was fine, they had already been weighing chances as to whether I would ever return, and trying to decide whether they should wait longer or begin to seek their way back to the lowlands. Now their curious troubles were over. They packed their precious sketches, and the next morning we set out, homeward bound, and in 2 days entered the Yosemite Valley from the north by way of Indian Canyon.